Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin with a question that's often put in politics. Where does poverty come from? And we're often challenged by this. Nelson Mandela once said, poverty is no more a natural condition than apartheid. Where does it come from? I have to stand back and say perhaps this is the wrong question. Think about the history of our species. Think about the way in which most human beings lived for the last million years. We lived in crushing, grinding poverty until an eye blink ago. The really interesting question is not where does poverty come from, it's where does wealth come from? How did that happen? It's a little bit like when people say, where do boys learn violence, right? Whole academic institutes have been set up studying this question. Whole disciplines have been brought into existence. Where do boys learn violence? Come on, guys, look at a 3 or 4 year old boy, right? The only reason that he isn't doing more damage is because he can't curl his chubby little fingers around weapons yet, right? The interesting question is not where do boys learn violence, is where do boys learn unviolence? How have we managed to live in a modern civilization where we treat with each other peacefully? Similarly, when people say, where does corruption come from? If by corruption you mean taking advantage of opportunities to enrich yourself, that again is the natural condition of society. The relevant question is how have some places so structured the incentives that they don't have corruption, that people in power are forced to act in the general interest. So let me ask again, the right way around this. Where does wealth come from? How did we go from hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions of years, of pennilessness, penury, to the skyscrapers and the superabundance that we now take for granted? Well, there was a British Prime Minister in the interwar period called Stanley Baldwin. Very unideological, pragmatic politician. He was a conservative, but I don't think he really had much doctrine. And towards the end of his life, he was asked the question, did you follow any thinkers? Were you influenced by any academic theories or any particular philosophers? And rather to the surprise of the interviewer, because Stanley Baldwin was not known as a man who read books, he said, actually, yes, I was. When I was a young man, I was very influenced by the writings and teachings of Sir Henry Maine, a great Victorian jurist and anthropologist. He said, and it was by reading the works of Maine that I finally came to understand that all human progress is the story of the move from status to contract. And then he paused, frowning, and said, or was it the other way around? A cute story. It demonstrates how even the most sublime theories can become worn through overuse. But I want you just to think for a second about those three words: status to contract. For most of the time that we have had what we call civilization, post-agrarian life, right? Our relations one with another have been mediated by birth, by caste, by tradition. The breakthrough is allowing two people to come to an agreement one with another purely, freely, without needing to ask the permission of a king or a priest or anybody else. The elevation of the individual above the collective, the recognition of personal dignity, is the basis of modern progress. Think about it. 10,000 years ago, somewhere, actually in several places, by parallel evolution, one of our ancestors noticed that seeds produce plants, right? Beginning of the what we call the agrarian revolution, right? Somebody noticed that you could grow crops instead of having to hunt all of your own food. I'm afraid it took about 5 minutes before somebody else realized that it was easier, instead of spending a whole year tending to your own crops and harvesting them, it was easier to let somebody else do all the work and then steal his harvest. We can be a rapacious species. And then probably about 5 minutes after that came the most dangerous breakthrough of all. Somebody clocked that if you really wanted to maximize the ratio of effort to outcome, if you really wanted to optimize your position, you should regularize that theft through a series of tithes and tolls and taxes. And thus was human civilization born in tyranny. And that was the lot of almost every human being on this planet for the next 10,000 years. Servitude, serfdom, oppression, slavery. Almost everyone. What we call history was the history of the top 1% of the top 1%. The rest of us were working dawn to dusk in the fields day after day until something happened in the last 200 or 300 years, and we began to break that cycle and to be able to relate one to another as sovereign individuals. So what was that something? What was that move from status to contract? What's the thing that unlocks the wealth of a country? Well, one way of asking that question is, we had all that debate during the Trump years about the wall and who was, were the Mexicans going to pay for this wall to stop migration. Nobody has ever proposed, no Mexican politician has ever had to suggest that they build a wall along their northern border to stop US immigrants flooding into Mexico. Now, why is that? Why has the movement of population in the Americas been overwhelmingly one way? It's not a question of resources. South America, Latin America more broadly, if anything, has the edge when it comes to deposits of gold and silver, petroleum and so on. They were settled at around the same time. And Spain, when they settled South America, was a more powerful country than England in the 16th century. What was the difference? Why is it that North America has grown into a place that has schools, clinics, incorruptible, relatively incorruptible judges, impartial police, regular elections, uncensored newspapers, all the things that the migrants from Mexico and Guatemala and my own native Peru are trying to get away from, or to reach to get away from what they don't have in their own countries? Again, it's to do with structures. The richest man in the US gets to be rich by offering a service to people around him for a price that they're prepared to pay. The richest man in Mexico gets rich through the favors of government, by creating monopolies that disable his rivals, or indeed nowadays by trading in narcotics with government collusion. Right? My point is, it was the US that was the outlier. For most of human history, every society was structured more or less like Mexico, in the sense that the way to succeed was not to try and produce a service that everyone wanted. The way to succeed was to suck up to the people in power, whether they were kings or commissars or priests or whatever it was. The move from status to contract was the breaking of that cycle, the opening of a different kind of world. Now, here's the point I really want to make. That is deeply counterintuitive. We are tribal creatures. We evolved in kin groups. We think collectively. The elevation of the individual over the group, which is the basis of prosperity, does not come naturally. On some deep level, it feels wrong. Which is why in every generation, there are revolts against it. Whether in the form of romanticism, fascism, communism, all based on the idea that somehow we are alienated from this materialistic world. People always pine for some collective home. And over the last 18 months, those instincts we have, those collectivist instincts, have been given a huge boost. Whenever there is a collective threat, a natural disaster, a war, people become, it's a phenomenon well measured by psychologists, people become more intolerant, more autocratic, more demanding of state government, of intervention, of the smack of firm government. And we've all seen this. I mean, one very small example. As the Vice-Chancellor says, I'm on the board of trade. One of the things I try and do is I promote trade because it always makes everybody richer. I mean, one of the few things that every economist will agree on. And yet, always a counterintuitive idea. And the number of people who were previously free marketeers, who could understand this intellectually, but who, during the last 18 months, have said to me things like, well, surely, Hannon, surely even you now understand why we need to grow our own food. You've just seen this terrible global pandemic. Really? Really? That's what you've got from the pandemic, that we need to try and be self-sufficient? I mean, the pandemic hit in March 2020, end of March. Our lockdown came at the end of March. That's the time in my country that farmers call the hungry gap. They basically don't grow any food. The only food we produce in April in the UK is asparagus and rhubarb, and maybe a little bit of purple sprouting broccoli, right? Fortunately, it didn't matter, because we were able to source all the food we needed from wherever we wanted in the world. A point that is counterintuitive but true is that if you want security in food, the way you get it is to have a broad diversity of different suppliers so that you are not vulnerable to one local shock. And you are just as vulnerable if you are dependent on one producer in your own country, right? But that is a difficult and counterintuitive idea, even in normal times. And now, I'm afraid, in the aftermath of the epidemic, I see people withdrawing. This is true whether it's food or vaccine or PPE. The idea that you should try and produce everything yourself, in fact, makes you vulnerable. When people say the global economy is fragile, you get a ship stuck in the Suez Canal, and you say, yeah, okay, maybe. But if you want real fragility, look at a country that has sought self-sufficiency. If you want a country that is truly vulnerable, look at somewhere like North Korea, where self-sufficiency has been elevated to the supreme governing principle. Deeply counterintuitive idea. People always say, why can't government step in and solve this problem? And yet we know that whenever governments try to do that, they make things worse. If I may, with your permission, Vice-Chancellor, this being where I am and with this audience, I'm going to quote a very ancient source of authority in support of this proposition. During the Prophet's exile in Medina, there was a food shortage. And the leaders of the community came to him and said, Prophet, you need to tell the market traders to cut their prices. Well, of course, he was a businessman. He was a trader. He'd spent his life understanding how commerce works. And so he knew very well what would happen if you step in and artificially order a price cut. What happens is first you get a glut, everyone sells what they've got, rushes to buy, but then you get a worse shortage than before because nobody will bring produce to market for an artificially cheap price. So although it's always popular, when a government says, I will cut rents or cut prices, it always makes the problem worse. Now consider this, that 1400 years afterwards, we still struggle to understand that. So the Prophet, when presented with a delegation, said, provision is in the hands of the Almighty. Prices are in the hands of God. How many people over the last year, in Britain, in Pakistan, or anywhere else, have said, it's outrageous to have people selling hand sanitizer or face masks or PPE for excessive prices. Why can't we fix the prices of it? Why can't we make things more affordable, right? All those centuries have passed, and people still struggle to understand the point that the Prophet was making, because it doesn't come naturally. We have to learn it. And let me leave you then, if I may, with this thought. This is what universities are for. This is what schools and universities exist to do. It's to encourage us to identify where our instincts and intuitions lead us astray, and where empirical data can put us on a better path. We no longer live as our hunter-gatherer ancestors did, on the savannas of Pleistocene Africa, needing to be self-sufficient, needing to have enough food to get us through the winter. We now live in a world where we can depend on people that we don't know to supply us with stuff that we can't yet see. And that move from status to contract made that world possible. It's given us a level of prosperity and happiness that our ancestors could not have imagined. We take for granted powers that previous generations would have attributed to wizards or gods. But there was no magic. The only trick was to break the power of the collective and to liberate the genius of the individual. And I hope, as we come out of this, first the pandemic itself and then the recession that it has triggered, that we will, particularly in institutions of learning, we will restore our mission of teaching people the counter-cyclical, counter-intuitive truths that have made for this extraordinary cycle of wealth that we are privileged to inhabit. We must surely be the most ungrateful generation ever. Okay, look at any metric you like: literacy, longevity, female education, calorie intake. We've never had it so good, and we have never been so discontented. That's the protest cry of our inner caveman. But the job of a place like this is to show that the caveman has not adapted to the modern world. And I wish you every success in that endeavor. And in the remaining time, I think let's take some questions. So I'll hand over to the Vice-Chancellor. Thank you very much.